They knew it was a bad day for the trip, but it was too late to turn back. The friends met for the first time in a long time and decided to go on vacation. It was a foggy evening, and on the way they had to drive through a deserted section, an abandoned part of the highway that had long been excluded from the main routes. Once it was an ordinary road, but over time, traffic almost stopped here due to accidents and disappearances that began to occur too often. Michael, Sam and Rebecca were sitting in the car, exchanging hilarious jokes. They were sure that their path was just a shortcut through a forgotten place, and soon they would find themselves on the main highway. But instead, the emptiness of the highway around them began to seem endless. Not a single streetlight, not a single oncoming car. Only the gray sky, heavy with clumps of fog, and the road that stretched like an endless ribbon before their eyes. "I think we're lost," Rebecca said anxiously, staring at the GPS. "His signal is gone here." "Nonsense, it's just temporary," grinned Michael, the driver and the main optimist of the group. "Let's just drive on. I'm sure we'll find some gas station soon." But there was no gas station. The road remained dead. Time passed, and now the night began to thicken outside the window. Finally, Sam suggested, "Can we stop? I have a feeling that we missed something." Michael reluctantly slowed down. They all got out of the car, looking around. Silence. Even the wind was not blowing, and the air seemed heavy and humid. There was no sound, no sign of life, just an old road that looked like it hadn't been used for decades. "This place," Sam began, but Rebecca interrupted him. "Look," she pointed to something ahead, around a bend in the road. A dim light loomed in the distance, as if from lanterns or a small house. Hope flashed across their faces. "Let's go there? Maybe there's someone there who can help us," Michael said, getting back behind the wheel. As they approached, the light became more distinct. It was an old roadside motel, half demolished but still with a semblance of work. 20 years ago, such places could be found on any highway. Small, cozy rooms where tired travelers stayed overnight. But now the motel looked like a forgotten relic from another time, with dim lights and peeling paint on the walls. "At least the lights are on," Rebecca said with cautious relief. They got out of the car and headed for the front door. The doorbell was ringing when Michael opened the door. Inside was a reception room, furnished with old furniture and old photographs on the walls. A middle-aged man with a tired face that almost blended into the shabby walls was sitting at the counter. He looked at them without showing much interest. "Do you need a room?" His voice was as tired as he was. "Yes, if I may," Michael replied, looking around. "We need to stop for one night. It seems that we have lost our way a little." "You're not the only ones who come here by accident," the man said. His words sounded strange, but Michael just nodded. "Do you have any rooms available?" Rebecca asked, trying to hide her anxiety. The man looked at them for a little longer than politeness required, but then nodded and handed them the key to one of the rooms. "Take the second floor, room 12. Only, the door may jam, so try not to pull too hard." Michael took the key and thanked the man. The three of them headed for the stairs, which creaked under their feet. The walls of the motel seemed old, shabby, and it seemed like they hadn't seen a renovation in a long time. Room 12 turned out to be tiny, with a dirty carpet and an old wooden wardrobe. There was a damp smell in the air, as if it hadn't been aired in ages. Rebecca opened the window, trying to let in some fresh air, but even outside the air was stuffy and still. The motel was far away from everything, and not a single sound of civilization reached their ears. "Okay, it's not 5 stars, but at least a roof over your head," Michael tried to joke, throwing his things on the bed. They decided that the best thing they could do was go to bed and hit the road in the morning. But as soon as night fell, something began to change. Sam couldn't sleep. A strange feeling of anxiety wouldn't let him go. He tried to turn over several times, but each time a creak attracted his attention. At first it was the creaking of the floorboards under their feet. Then it was as if someone was quietly walking in the corridor outside the door. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, sitting up on the bed. "What?" Rebecca replied, stretching sleepily. "There's someone walking in the hallway. Maybe it's that weird motel owner." Michael muttered, but he listened too. The footsteps outside the door grew louder and heavier, as if someone was wandering back and forth, sometimes stopping right at their door. Sam got up and, without turning on the light, slowly walked to the door, pressing his ear to the tree. Fear was building inside him, but he couldn't figure out what exactly was bothering him. This place, this night, everything seemed wrong. Michael also came to the door, trying to convince Sam that it was just their imagination. He slowly turned the handle and opened the door. The dark corridor turned out to be empty, but the feeling of the presence of something strange did not let go. "Nothing, it's empty," Michael said, but then his gaze fell to the floor. The thin layer of dust that covered everything around clearly showed traces. There was a clear print of a bare foot right in front of their door. Michael and Sam exchanged glances. It couldn't be a figment of their imagination. The footprints were too real. The dirty prints of bare feet went along the corridor and were lost in the semi-darkness. Contrary to logic, they decided to check where they were going. Michael, although skeptical, realized that this was no longer a joke. Rebecca came closer, asking in a trembling voice, "Maybe you don't need to? I don't like it." But Michael had already stepped into the hallway. The heavy air pressed down on them, as if the walls of the old motel were not just aging. They seemed to shrink, getting tighter with every step. The dim light of the lamps barely illuminated the way, and only the creaking of the wooden floorboards reminded them that they were still here in reality. "Are you coming?" Michael asked Sam, who was still standing in the doorway of the room. "Yes, but there's something wrong here, Michael. We don't even know who it could be." "Maybe it's the guy from the reception desk," Michael replied, but there was no certainty in his voice. "Let's just take a look and come back." They moved slowly forward, following a corridor lit only by the uneven light of old lamps. Footprints in the dust led down the stairs. The staircase, which had seemed old during the day, now looked almost frightening. Every step of it echoed in the dead building. They went downstairs, but when they got to the lobby, it was empty. The man who was sitting at the counter disappeared. The counter itself seemed even more abandoned than during the day, as if no one had been here for many years. "Maybe he went to sleep?" Sam suggested, but his voice was full of doubt. Michael looked around, but his gaze stopped on the wall behind the counter. He hadn't paid attention to her before, but now something seemed strange. There was a small board with room keys on the wall, but one key was strangely highlighted. Instead of the usual iron keychain, an old yellowed note was tied to it. Michael came closer and, unable to resist curiosity, took the note in his hands. On it, in barely discernible ink, was written, "Never open room 7. If you're here, run." Sam came closer, his eyes widening. "Is this some kind of joke?" "What is it?" he asked, but Michael didn't answer. At that moment, there was a slight creaking sound behind them, as if a door had opened somewhere. They both turned at the sound and saw that the door leading to the back hallway was barely ajar. At first, they saw nothing but darkness, but then the door slowly swung open a little more, and a shadow appeared behind it. It was not a human figure, but rather something indistinct, like movement in the dark that could not be accurately described. Both of them suddenly had dry throats, and they felt their backs go cold. "We have to get out of here," Sam whispered hoarsely, backing away. But Michael stood his ground. His gaze was fixed on the hallway. He felt an inexplicable attraction to that door, as if something was calling him there, forcing him to take a step forward. Sam had already grabbed his arm, but Michael seemed paralyzed by this eerie, gloomy corridor that led into the unknown. Meanwhile, Rebecca, who remained in the room, began to realize that the guys were staying too long. Deciding that something was wrong, she dressed and went to look for them. She saw them standing at the bottom, frozen in front of a strange, slightly open door. "What are you guys doing there?" she called out to them as she went down the stairs. But when she came closer and also saw that shadow outside the door, her face turned pale. Something about this place was completely wrong. It was as if the building itself, this motel, was pulling them into its walls, forcing them to stay here forever. "Michael, let's get out of here," Rebecca almost shouted. "I don't want to be here anymore." Suddenly, the door at the end of the corridor slammed sharply. The noise was so loud that for a moment everyone's ears were blocked. Michael seemed to wake up from his stupor. He looked at Sam and Rebecca with a look of horror on his face. "We have to leave, now." They hurriedly headed back to their room, where their belongings were still left. Going up to the second floor, they heard a thud from the back of the building. Someone or something was clearly moving along the corridors behind them. The noise grew louder and closer. When they finally got to their room, Sam tried to lock the door, but the door, as the receptionist had warned, was jammed. Tugging at the handle, he finally slammed it shut. But suddenly, there was a rattling sound all over the room. The windows began to shake, as if someone was hitting the glass from outside. "We're not alone here," Rebecca whispered, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. At that moment, Sam suddenly turned around and saw something in the corner of the room that he hadn't noticed before. In the shadow between the wardrobe and the bed stood an old, worn suitcase. But the strangest thing was that it was locked with a rusty lock with a broken key, but it had obviously moved recently. There was no layer of dust around the suitcase on the floor. "This suitcase, it wasn't here before," he whispered, leaning closer. The suitcase was obviously old, but it looked like it had been touched recently. Sam touched it carefully, but the moment his fingers touched the lock, an icy draft swept through the room, and the door swung open abruptly. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and a cold wind rushed into the room, causing the windows to shake and the objects on the shelves to brush against each other. Sam, Rebecca, and Michael froze in horror, unable to take their eyes off the opening door. There was a man standing in the doorway, or what had once been a man. His face was distorted, his eyes soulless, and his clothes were torn and dirty. His feet were bare, and his feet were covered with traces of dirt and something else, obviously not human. "Please," he said faintly, taking a step forward at the same time. "You have to get out of here." "This is not your place," Rebecca screamed and jumped back against the back wall, while Michael and Sam were paralyzed, not knowing what to do. It couldn't be real. This man looked like a ghost from their worst nightmares. "Who are you?" Michael asked, but his voice was shaking. "I was here for so long," the strange man said, and his voice sounded as if it came from the distant past. His words were like a spell. "I got lost, and now I can't leave. You need to run while there is still time." Sam, terrified, slipped to the window looking for a way out, but there was only darkness outside the window. They were trapped. "It's just a man," Michael shouted, trying to keep his cool. "Maybe he's just confused like us." "No, it's not," Rebecca protested, her voice full of fear. "He's warning us. We have to leave." At that moment, the creaking sound was heard again. This time, it came from the corner of the room where the suitcase was standing. It was as if someone had tried to open it, and the lock couldn't stand the load. There was a clang of metal and a sharp click as the suitcase opened. Inside, there were things that once belonged to travelers, scraps of clothing, old letters, and photographs. However, there was something else among them, a dirty notebook that someone started filling out until something terrible happened. Rebecca came closer, trying to make out the text written in a worn pen. She bent over the notebook, and the words written on it made her hold her breath. "If you are reading this, then you are already here. There is no way out here, only the end. They're taking you away one by one." The words seemed to jump out of the page, as if they were trying to tell them what to do. They exchanged glances, and at that moment, everything became clear. What they thought was a simple motel was actually a place where people disappeared and no one could get out. Their hearts were pounding in unison, and they realized that maybe their time was running out. "Let's go now," Sam shouted, grabbing Michael's arm. "We have to get out." The creaking of footsteps sounded again, but now it sounded closer. Rebecca's legs felt like cotton wool, and she clutched at her suitcase, trying to figure out what to do. But the more she looked at the notes and things, the more a strange feeling came over her. This suitcase seems to have belonged to those who came here before them. She pulled out one of the pieces of clothing and saw the name on it, Dave. "It's not just a motel," she said, but her voice was shaking. "It's a trap." Sam turned toward the door when movement caught his attention. The open door began to creak again, and the man with the distorted face appeared in the doorway. "They're coming for you." "Stop it," he shouted. "You need to run. They won't stop until they pick you up." Michael rushed to the door, but the man suddenly grabbed his shoulder, and his face became very close. "Get out of here. I can't stop them. Don't let them catch you." His eyes were filled with horror, and there was a warning in them. Sam, seeing that Michael couldn't move, rushed to the door and pushed the man. He fell to the floor, but soon got up, and his face was distorted with fear again. "Please don't stay," he screamed, and then abruptly jerked towards the window. "They're coming." Without realizing how it happened, they found themselves outside, the air filled with the scent of dampness and rot. The silence enveloped them like a veil, and only the sounds of their own hearts resounded in the silence. They looked back at the motel. The dark windows, like black holes, looked like someone was looking at them. And then the silence was broken again. A sharp creak made them freeze. The man came out of the motel door again, but now he was different. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of madness. He was pointing them in the direction of the woods, which began right behind the motel. "Run!" he shouted, and his cry was filled with insane despair. They didn't wait. Their inner instinct told them to run, to escape from this place, from this curse. The forest seemed dark and impenetrable, but it didn't have the horror that the motel held. They ran, not knowing where, just to get away from this place. Yet the further they went, the more fear grew. The feeling of persecution did not leave them. They slipped past the trees, trying not to trip over the roots, but at the same time, they felt that someone was still watching them. Suddenly, Sam turned around and saw a shadow that swept past them, as if something sinister was rushing in their direction. He screamed, "Hurry up!" They were running past the trees when, suddenly, Rebecca stumbled and fell to the ground. But at that moment, she heard something whispering in the branches. "Rebecca!" Michael and Sam shouted, but she was already fainting from fear. The moment she looked up, she saw a figure standing right in front of her, from behind the trees. For a moment it seemed that he was just a man, but then she noticed something in his gaze that resembled thirst for souls. "Don't look at him," Sam shouted, but it was too late. Rebecca froze, her gaze fixed on the figure in front of her. It was the same man they had seen at the motel, but now he was different. His face, disfigured and full of pain, reflected the horror he was clearly experiencing. His eyes, as if they had absorbed all the light around them, looked straight at her without blinking. Michael and Sam rushed to Rebecca, but their legs felt like cotton wool. The ground beneath them seemed viscous, as if they were running through a swamp in which every step became more and more difficult. Heavy breathing sounded in his ears, and cold sweat streamed down his back. "Rebecca!" Sam shouted, but his voice sounded far away, as if the earth itself was absorbing his scream. The figure stood motionless, as if it were part of the forest. The man's face twisted into a terrible grimace. His lips parted, but no words were heard. Only the silence of the forest, piercing every cell of the body, made the moment unbearable. Rebecca began to slowly get to her feet, but she couldn't take her eyes off the stranger. He held out his hand as if calling her to him. Her body refused to obey. Her legs seemed rooted to the ground. A small voice sounded in my head. "Come here. You have to. They'll be picking you up soon." This voice was not her own. It was not real, but still she felt it as if it came from the very earth. "Run away!" Michael screamed in desperation, and it seemed to snap her out of her stupor. Rebecca jerked back, falling to her knees and trying to push off the ground. At the same moment, the figure took off from its place, as if it were part of some crazy plan, and rushed towards her. Time seemed to have stopped. Sam rushed to her, grabbed her arm, and pulled her towards him. Michael ran from behind, looking back at this figure, which was rapidly approaching, but its movements were unnaturally fast, as if it did not touch the ground. "Hurry up!" "He's catching up." They ran like they had never run in their lives. The forest around them grew denser, the trees seemed taller, and the ground beneath their feet became more uneven. But neither Sam nor Michael stopped. Every step was on the verge of despair. The sounds of the chase were getting closer. Footsteps, breathing, something that could not be described in words but was clearly chasing them. Finally, they ran out into the clearing. The air was heavy. They were suffocating from fatigue, but the pursuit did not stop. The forest behind them seemed endless, and the darkness that reigned in it seemed to be watching them. They turned around, and their gazes stopped at the edge of the forest. The shadow that was chasing them froze at the very edge of the clearing, as if it was connected to the forest, unable to go beyond it. Why did he stop? Michael croaked, breathing heavily and looking at the figure. The figure stood motionless, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the trees. There was a kind of hatred in his eyes, but also despair. Michael took a few steps back, making sure that no one else came closer to the forest. "What now?" Rebecca asked in a broken voice, still in shock from what had happened. At that moment, they realized that they did not know where they were. The clearing was completely surrounded by forest, but the path they were running along was no longer visible. All three figures froze in the center of the clearing, and it began to dawn on them that they were not saved, but only temporarily sheltered from the horror that awaited them in the forest. "We have to get out of here. Find our way back," Sam said softly, but his voice was shaking. He felt that they were still being watched. Rebecca asked, her voice almost breaking into a sob. "We don't even know where we are. We can't go back there." Michael scanned the clearing carefully, and his gaze stopped at an old abandoned building that was barely visible among the trees on the opposite side. It looked like a dilapidated house, long forgotten and overgrown with vines, but it was the only shelter they could find in this hell. "We have to go there," he pointed at the building. "Maybe there's a phone there, or at least a place to hide." Sam and Rebecca looked at him, and although the idea didn't seem good, they had no other options. The shadows behind them began to move slowly.